The winter sun struggled to pierce the heavy clouds over the Whitlock estate, its feeble light casting long, cold shadows through the towering glass windows. Inside the grand mansion, time seemed to stretch out, indifferent to the world beyond its ornate gates. The scent of fresh lilies from the marble entryway did little to mask the pervasive emptiness in the air. Evelyn Whitlock, the lady of the house, sat by the grand piano, though her fingers remained still, poised just above the ivory keys. She stared through the windows, her eyes clouded with something unspoken, something gnawing at her soul. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was suffocating. Her husband, Nathaniel Whitlock, was a man of means, a self-made millionaire whose ambition had carved their life out of fortune and sacrifice. Yet, despite the vast wealth that surrounded her, Evelyn felt a strange hollowness, as though the mansion itself was built on brittle foundations. In the kitchen, muted sounds of utensils clinking and footsteps on the polished tile floor carried on without much notice. Rosa Mendez, the maid, moved with precision, folding pristine white napkins with the care of someone who knew every detail mattered, even when no one acknowledged it. Her presence was like a whisper in the grand, echoing hallways. She had grown accustomed to invisibility. But today, there was a palpable tension in the air. A whisper turned to a crackle of energy that neither woman could ignore. It began when Evelyn's diamond bracelet went missing. The bracelet wasn't just jewelry. It was a relic of trust. Given to her on their 5th anniversary, it symbolized a fragile piece of happiness in an otherwise fractured marriage. When Evelyn discovered the empty velvet box, a chill climbed up her spine. The whisper of doubt became an accusation that refused to be ignored. Nathaniel found her standing motionless in front of her dresser. His brow furrowed with concern, though his voice was tight, clipped. "What's wrong?" he asked, his gaze flicking to the open jewelry box. "It's gone," Evelyn said, her voice a thin thread of sound. "The bracelet." A beat of silence followed, heavy and dangerous. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. The bracelet was worth a small fortune, but it wasn't the cost that mattered. It was the principle. In his world, betrayal was not just a personal failure. It was a stain on control, a crack in the flawless veneer of power he fought to maintain. "Have you asked the staff?" His words carried a cold edge. Evelyn nodded, a tightness in her throat. "Only Rosa has been in and out of my room today." Nathaniel's eyes hardened. He strode toward the kitchen, his footsteps sharp against the marble floors. The walls seemed to close in with every step. Rosa was folding the last napkin when she saw him. She straightened immediately, smoothing the front of her worn apron. "Mr. Whitlock," she greeted him with a nod, her voice humble yet steady. Nathaniel's gaze pinned her in place, a storm swirling behind his eyes. "Rosa," he said, each word measured. "My wife's diamond bracelet has gone missing. You were in her room today." Rosa's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise that she tried to suppress. "I would never." He cut her off, his voice low but ice-cold. "I'm not asking for explanations. Did you take it?" "No," she replied softly, the hurt trembling beneath her calm exterior. "I've never stolen anything in my life, sir." Her hands tightened around the napkin she held, the fabric bunching in her grip. She looked him in the eye, not with defiance, but with a quiet desperation that begged to be understood. Nathaniel's lips thinned. He turned to the head of security standing by the doorway. "Search her things." The order landed like a slap. Rosa flinched, the heat of shame flooding her cheeks. Without a word, she stepped aside and let them rifle through the meager contents of her bag and the small, faded suitcase where she kept her belongings. It didn't take long. No bracelet was found, only a few coins, a photograph of her late mother, and a worn Bible with fragile pages. But the absence of proof wasn't enough to shatter the accusation. The damage was already done. "Leave," Nathaniel said, his voice devoid of empathy. "You're fired. Collect your things and go. Now." The finality in his tone left no room for protest. Rosa's throat tightened, the sting of betrayal coating every breath. She glanced once toward Evelyn, who stood in the hallway, silent and pale, as though her own voice had been taken. Without a second word, Rosa turned away. She lifted her small suitcase, its weight far heavier than it had ever been before. As she walked toward the servants' entrance, the air seemed to press down on her, thick with the judgment she could not escape. The cold wind bit at her face as she stepped outside, but the chill inside her heart was colder still. The sun had dipped below the horizon by the time Rosa reached the edge of the estate. The wrought iron gate loomed behind her, its cold bars marking the divide between two worlds, one of gleaming wealth and one she was no longer welcome in. Her breath clouded in the icy air, but she barely noticed. The weight of humiliation was heavier than the chill. Her fingers tightened around the worn leather handle of her suitcase. Her feet moved forward, one step, then another, but her mind lingered behind, trapped in that moment of accusation, the disbelief in Nathaniel Whitlock's eyes cutting deeper than any blade. She had worked for the Whitlocks for 4 years. Never once had she given them reason to doubt her. But trust, she realized, was as fragile as glass, easily shattered and impossible to repair. As she walked toward the bus stop, her thoughts drifted to her mother, who had taught her that dignity was the one thing no one could take unless you allowed it. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. Stay true to yourself, Rosa, even when the world doubts you. But Rosa's heart clenched. How could she stay true to herself when no one believed in her? The quiet street stretched ahead, dimly lit by flickering street lamps. A sudden gust of wind swept through, rustling the brittle leaves that had gathered along the curb. The world felt cold, indifferent. Just as she reached the bus stop, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She hesitated before pulling it out, half expecting it to be some final blow. The screen glowed with a text message from an unknown number. Meet me tonight, the alley behind St. Luke's Church. There's something you need to know. Her brow furrowed. Her thumb hovered over the screen, uncertainty gnawing at her. She should ignore it, she knew. After everything that had happened today, the last thing she needed was another shadowy encounter. But something about the message prickled at the edges of her mind. A whisper of familiarity she couldn't shake. Before she could overthink it, she boarded the arriving bus, the decision made. The engine groaned as it pulled away, the lights of the Whitlock mansion fading behind her. Nathaniel's study. Back at the mansion, Nathaniel paced in his study, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts he couldn't silence. The fire crackled in the hearth, but its warmth didn't reach him. He rubbed his temples, the weight of his own decisions pressing against his skull. He had done the right thing. He was sure of it. Theft couldn't be tolerated. And yet, doubt lingered like a persistent shadow. Rosa's eyes haunted him, wide with disbelief and something deeper, something he hadn't wanted to see. Innocence. He poured himself a glass of scotch, the amber liquid catching the firelight. As he took a slow sip, his gaze fell on the photograph on his desk. A picture of his younger self standing beside his father, a man who taught him that weakness was unforgivable, that trust was a currency that could only be spent once. A bitter laugh escaped his lips. He had spent that currency today, and it left an aftertaste he couldn't swallow. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he said, his voice rough. Evelyn stepped inside, her face pale and drawn. She closed the door softly behind her, as though afraid to disturb the ghosts that lingered in the corners. "Nathaniel," she said, her voice trembled. "I can't stop thinking about Rosa." He didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the swirling patterns in his glass. "What if we were wrong?" she continued. "What if she didn't do it?" Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "We can't afford to second-guess ourselves, Evelyn. The bracelet is gone. Someone took it. But what if?" Her voice cracked, and she turned away, pressing her fingers to her lips. Nathaniel's chest ached at the sight of her distress, but his pride wouldn't allow him to admit doubt. "Not yet. I need some air," she whispered, leaving him alone once more with his swirling thoughts. St. Luke's Church. The bus dropped Rosa off at the corner. The towering silhouette of St. Luke's Church loomed ahead, its ancient stone facade casting deep shadows beneath the flickering streetlight. She hesitated at the mouth of the alley, her breath catching in her throat. The darkness seemed to breathe, alive with hidden secrets. She took a steadying breath and stepped into the alley, her shoes crunching on gravel. Her eyes scanned the shadows, heart pounding. Rosa! She turned sharply at the voice. A figure stepped out of the darkness. A man, his face partially obscured by the brim of a hat. But when he tilted his head up, the dim light revealed sharp cheekbones, a scar tracing the line of his jaw, and eyes that held a weary kind of wisdom. Her breath caught. Miguel? He nodded, his expression somber. What are you doing here? Her voice was a whisper, a mixture of fear and hope. Miguel stepped closer, his eyes scanning the alley as though they were being watched. I heard what happened at the Whitlocks. He paused. I need to show you something. He held out a small velvet box, the kind that expensive jewelry came in. Rosa's stomach dropped. Where did you get that? She whispered. From someone who shouldn't have it. He opened the box, and there, nestled in the plush fabric, was Evelyn Whitlock's diamond bracelet. The very bracelet she had been accused of stealing. Rosa's vision blurred. Anger, relief, and confusion churned in her chest. Who took it? Her voice trembled. Miguel's eyes darkened. Someone who wants to hurt them. Someone who knew you'd take the fall. Her knees felt weak. Why are you showing me this? Because you deserve to know the truth, he said softly. And because it's time for you to decide who you want to be. The weight of his words settled over her. The choice before her wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about reclaiming her dignity. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind once more. Stay true to yourself, Rosa, even when the world doubts you. Her eyes hardened with determination. She would not let this lie define her. I need to go back, she said, her voice steady. Miguel nodded, a hint of a smile touching his lips. Then let's go. Together, they stepped out of the shadows and into the night, the truth clutched tightly in their hands. The night was dense and cold, but Rosa barely felt it. Each step toward the Whitlock mansion was fueled by anger and resolve. Miguel walked beside her, his presence solid, grounding. The small velvet box felt heavy in her pocket, the weight of the truth pressing against her. When they reached the towering iron gates of the estate, Rosa hesitated. Her eyes traced the sprawling silhouette of the mansion, the place where she had worked, served, and trusted, the place that had turned on her in an instant. Miguel placed a hand on her shoulder. You don't have to do this alone. She looked at him, her eyes dark with determination. Yes, I do. He nodded, stepping back. I'll be here if you need me. Taking a deep breath, Rosa pushed open the smaller side gate and slipped inside. The gravel crunched beneath her feet as she walked toward the servants' entrance. The lights in the mansion glowed dimly, casting ghostly shadows on the lawn. She paused just outside the kitchen door, her heart pounding. The world felt fragile, balanced on the edge of a knife. This is it, she thought. The moment everything changes. With trembling fingers, she knocked. Inside the mansion, the sharp knock echoed through the kitchen, startling Evelyn, who was pouring herself a glass of water. Her hand jerked, and the glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the tile floor. She stared at the door, her breath caught in her throat. The house had felt uneasy since Rosa left, as though something vital had been stripped away. The shadows seemed darker, the air colder. Hesitantly, she moved toward the door and opened it. Rosa stood there, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion and something else. Something fierce. Rosa! Evelyn's voice was barely a whisper. Guilt twisted inside her, an ache she couldn't suppress. What are you doing here? Rosa took a step forward, her voice steady. I need to speak to Mr. Whitlock. Evelyn's gaze dropped to the ground. Rosa, I'm so sorry. Please, Rosa said, her tone soft but firm. This isn't about apologies. It's about the truth. Evelyn swallowed and nodded, stepping aside to let Rosa in. The study. Nathaniel was still in his study, the scotch untouched on the desk before him. The fire had died down, leaving only glowing embers. His mind was a mess of unresolved thoughts, echoes of doubt and guilt colliding in a chaotic dance. When the door opened, he turned sharply, expecting to see Evelyn. But it wasn't his wife standing there. It was Rosa. His breath caught in his chest. She stepped inside, her eyes locked on his. There was no fear in her gaze, only resolve. Evelyn hovered in the doorway, her hands clasped tightly together. Nathaniel's voice was rough. "What are you doing here?" Rosa didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the small velvet box. She set it on the desk between them, the sound of it landing like a stone dropped into still water. Nathaniel's eyes widened. His fingers moved to the box, trembling slightly as he opened it. The diamond bracelet glittered under the dim light, a cruel reminder of his mistake. "Where did you get this?" His voice was hoarse. Rosa's gaze didn't waver. "Someone planted it. Someone who wanted you to doubt me, to make you believe I was a thief." The room was deathly silent. Nathaniel's mind raced, the implications unraveling like a tightly coiled spring. His throat felt dry, his stomach twisted in knots. The accusation he had hurled so easily now felt like a weight crushing his chest. Evelyn's voice broke the silence, trembling and raw. "Who would do this?" Rosa took a deep breath. "I don't know. But whoever it was knew exactly how to hurt you, how to make you turn on someone who never deserved it." Nathaniel's face crumpled. He sank into his chair, the strength draining from his body. The betrayal, the realization of his own failure, was overwhelming. He had been so quick to judge, so blind to the truth. His voice was a whisper. "Rosa, I'm so sorry." She watched him, her expression unreadable. The apology was a start, but it couldn't erase the pain, the humiliation. Still, deep inside her, a flicker of compassion stirred. This man, powerful and proud, now looked small and broken. Her mother's voice whispered in her mind again. "Forgiveness isn't weakness. It's strength." Rosa's shoulders softened, but she kept her chin high. "I didn't come here for an apology, Mr. Whitlock. I came here because the truth matters. And because whoever did this is still out there." Nathaniel nodded, his eyes glistening. "I'll find out who's behind this. I swear it." Evelyn stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "We'll make this right, Rosa. We owe you that." Rosa's eyes softened, a quiet acceptance settling in. "I hope you do." She turned to leave, the weight on her heart slightly lighter. Miguel was waiting for her, and for the first time in hours, she felt a shred of hope. As the door closed behind her, Nathaniel buried his face in his hands, the bitter taste of regret overwhelming him. But beneath the regret, a spark of determination flared. He had made a mistake, a terrible one, but he would not let the betrayal go unanswered. He would find the person who had done this, and he would make it right. The early hours of the morning crept over the Whitlock estate, pale light filtering through the curtains, casting the study in a soft, cold glow. Nathaniel hadn't moved from his chair. His eyes were bloodshot, fixed on the empty fireplace. The bracelet lay on the desk, a cruel reminder of his misjudgment. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. He didn't look up until Evelyn entered, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. She carried a cup of coffee, placing it on the desk before sitting opposite him. "Nathaniel," she said softly, "we need to talk." He nodded but didn't meet her gaze. "I know. There's more to this than just a missing bracelet." Her voice trembled, but she pressed on. "Someone wanted to hurt us. Someone who knows our weaknesses." Nathaniel's jaw clenched. "And I played right into their hands." Evelyn hesitated. "I've been thinking about the staff, about the people who come in and out of this house. Maybe we've trusted the wrong person." He looked up, his eyes narrowing. "You think it's someone on the inside?" "It has to be," she replied. "Who else would know the routines, the access points, where I keep my jewelry?" Her words hung in the air, cold and damning. Nathaniel leaned back, the wheels in his mind turning. He had always been careful about who he allowed into his world. Trust was a scarce resource, and yet here they were, betrayed from within. A sudden thought jolted through him. Where's Marcus? Evelyn's brow furrowed. Marcus? You think it's him? Marcus Hale had been their butler for just over a year. He was efficient, discreet, and unassuming. Perhaps too unassuming. Nathaniel's gut twisted. He hated how easily suspicion came now, how fragile his trust had become. Let's talk to him, Nathaniel said, his voice hardening. Evelyn nodded, a flicker of unease in her eyes. We need to be sure. The interrogation. The Whitlocks found Marcus in the dining room, setting the table for breakfast. The clink of fine china against polished wood was the only sound in the cavernous space. Marcus, Nathaniel said, his voice sharp. Marcus straightened, his gloved hands pausing mid-motion. His face was a carefully constructed mask of politeness. Yes, sir? Nathaniel's eyes bore into him. We need to talk. Now. Marcus's gaze flickered with something unreadable, but he nodded and followed them into the study. The door closed behind them with a soft click. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as she turned to face Marcus. Do you know anything about the bracelet that was taken? Marcus's expression didn't falter. No, ma'am. I was as surprised as anyone when I heard about it. Nathaniel stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. Don't lie to me, Marcus. Someone planted that bracelet to frame Rosa, and you've had access to every room in this house. Marcus's eyes narrowed just a fraction, his mask slipping. You're accusing me? I'm asking you, Nathaniel shot back. What do you know? A long silence stretched between them. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, a counterpoint to the tension thickening the air. Finally, Marcus sighed, his shoulders slumping. I know more than you think, he said, his voice soft but edged with bitterness. Evelyn's breath caught. What do you mean? Marcus's eyes darkened. I know what happens when loyalty is a one-way street. I've given this house everything, but it's never enough, is it? You see us, the staff, as nothing more than shadows. Nathaniel's fists clenched. That doesn't justify betrayal. A bitter smile twisted Marcus's lips. No, it doesn't. But it makes it understandable. He reached into his pocket, and both Nathaniel and Evelyn tensed. But all Marcus produced was a photograph, old and worn at the edges. He placed it on the desk. Evelyn picked it up, her brow furrowing. The image was of a woman holding a small child, her eyes shadowed with sadness. That's my sister, Marcus said, his voice hollow. She worked for a family not unlike yours. They trusted her until they didn't. When something went missing, they turned on her just like you turned on Rosa. She lost everything, and she didn't survive it. Evelyn's hand flew to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. Marcus, he shook his head. I didn't take the bracelet, but I knew someone would, and I knew how easily you'd believe the worst. He looked at Nathaniel, his eyes blazing with resentment. Your mistrust did the rest. Nathaniel's chest ached, the weight of his choices crushing him. Who took it, Marcus? Who set Rosa up? Marcus's gaze hardened. You'll have to find that out yourself. With that, he turned and walked out of the study, leaving behind a silence that screamed louder than words, the truth lurking in shadows. Evelyn sank into a chair, her hands trembling. Nathaniel, what have we done? He shook his head, his eyes hollow. We let our own fear destroy the people who trusted us. And someone exploited that. He stood abruptly, his mind a whirlwind. The betrayal was a spider's web, and they were caught in it. Marcus's story was a bitter pill to swallow, but it revealed a truth he could no longer ignore. We need to find out who's behind this, Nathaniel said, determination flaring in his eyes. Before it's too late. Evelyn nodded, her jaw set. We owe it to Rosa, and to ourselves. They didn't know where the next thread of the mystery would lead, but one thing was certain. The shadows in their home held secrets yet to be revealed, and they were running out of time to uncover them. The mansion felt like a labyrinth of doubt, every shadow holding the potential for treachery. Nathaniel's footsteps echoed through the halls, each step heavier than the last. Evelyn walked beside him, her face pale and drawn. The weight of suspicion pressed on them both, but beneath it simmered a determination to uncover the truth. The study door creaked open, and Nathaniel paused. He turned back to Evelyn. We need to speak to everyone. One of them knows more than they've let on. She nodded, though her eyes reflected hesitation. We need to tread carefully. Whoever did this, they're desperate. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. Desperation can make people reckless. They gathered the remaining household staff in the drawing room. A housekeeper named Miriam, the gardener Philip, the cook Margaret, and a young footman, Leo. Each of them wore expressions ranging from confusion to fear. Nathaniel's eyes scanned the room, his voice low but firm. We know someone framed Rosa. We also know that person is still here. A murmur of discomfort spread through the group. Philip shifted uneasily, while Margaret's fingers twitched nervously against her apron. Evelyn spoke softly, trying to ease the tension. We trusted all of you, but trust has been broken. We need the truth, for everyone's sake. Silence hung in the air like a storm cloud. Then Leo, the footman, stepped forward. He was barely 20, with earnest brown eyes and a tremor in his hands. Mr. Whitlock, he said, his voice thin. I didn't mean for things to go so far. Nathaniel's eyes narrowed. Go on. Leo swallowed hard, his gaze darting toward the others. I saw someone in Mrs. Whitlock's room the morning the bracelet went missing. Evelyn's breath caught. Who? Leo's hands clenched at his sides. It was Miriam. A collective gasp filled the room. Miriam, the housekeeper, took a step back, her face blanching. That's a lie, she hissed, her eyes wide with panic. I've done nothing wrong. Nathaniel's voice was cold steel. Leo, are you sure about this? Leo nodded, though his eyes shone with tears. I didn't want to believe it, but I saw her leave Mrs. Whitlock's room, and she looked nervous. I didn't say anything because I was scared. Miriam's voice shook with anger. You little liar. I've worked here longer than you've been alive. I would never steal. But Nathaniel's gaze was locked on Miriam now, seeing something he hadn't before. A tightness around her eyes, a flicker of guilt that she tried desperately to hide. You knew about the bracelet, he said slowly, and you knew Rosa would be blamed. Miriam's breath came in shallow gasps. Her eyes darted to the door, as though considering an escape. But there was nowhere to run. Nathaniel's voice dropped to a whisper. Why, Miriam? Her face crumpled, the rage giving way to something older, darker. Because you made me invisible, she spat. 14 years I gave to this house. 14 years of loyalty, of bending over backwards to keep everything perfect. And what did it get me? Nothing. No thanks, no recognition. Just emptiness. Evelyn's voice was thick with disbelief. You would destroy someone else's life just because you felt overlooked? Miriam's laugh was hollow. It wasn't about Rosa. She was just convenient. I wanted you to feel it the way I've felt it all these years. To know what it's like when everything you believe in crumbles. Nathaniel's fists tightened, but his voice remained steady. You framed an innocent woman. You betrayed not just us, but yourself. Tears spilled down Miriam's cheeks, but her face was a twisted mask of defiance and regret. I thought it would make me feel better, but it didn't. It just made everything worse. The silence that followed was suffocating. Finally, Nathaniel took a deep breath. You need to leave this house, Miriam. What you've done. It can't be undone. Her shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of her. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the room, the sound of her footsteps fading into the distance. The weight of regret. As the door closed behind Miriam, a heavy silence settled over the room. The remaining staff exchanged uneasy glances, relief and fear mingling in their eyes. Nathaniel turned to Leo, his expression softening. Thank you for telling the truth. Leo nodded, tears streaming down his cheeks. I didn't want anyone to get hurt. Evelyn placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. You did the right thing. When the staff dispersed, Nathaniel and Evelyn stood alone in the drawing room, the enormity of the moment pressing down on them. We need to find Rosa, Evelyn whispered. We need to make this right. Nathaniel nodded, his throat tight. "We will." But even as he said the words, a deeper fear gnawed at him. Some mistakes left scars that no apology could heal. A chance for redemption. Rosa sat by the window of her small apartment, the dawn's light spilling in. The events of the past day had left her drained, her thoughts a tangled web of anger, sadness, and resignation. Miguel sat across from her, silent, giving her space to process. A knock at the door broke the stillness. Rosa's heart clenched. She hesitated before standing, her steps slow and cautious. When she opened the door, Nathaniel and Evelyn stood there, their faces etched with regret. "Rosa," Nathaniel said, his voice hoarse, "we were wrong. About everything." Evelyn's eyes brimmed with tears. "We're so sorry. We can't undo what we did, but we want to try to make it right." Rosa's chest tightened. She searched their faces, seeing the raw sincerity in their eyes. The wound was deep, but maybe, just maybe, healing was possible. "Trust isn't something you can buy back," she said quietly. Nathaniel nodded, his gaze dropping. "I know, but maybe we can start over. If you'll let us." A long silence stretched between them. Rosa's heart ached, torn between the bitterness of betrayal and the hope of redemption. Finally, she took a deep breath. "Starting over doesn't mean forgetting," she said. "But maybe it can mean forgiving." Relief washed over their faces. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a beginning. And sometimes a beginning was enough. The sun rose slowly over the city, its golden light spilling across the horizon, a beacon of hope after the long night. Rosa stood in her apartment doorway, watching Nathaniel and Evelyn with cautious eyes. The offer of forgiveness hung between them, fragile yet full of potential. Miguel stood slightly behind her, arms crossed, his gaze protective. He leaned in close and whispered, "You don't owe them anything, Rosa." She nodded, her jaw tight. "I know." But deep within, she also knew that forgiveness was more for herself than for them. Holding onto the hurt felt like gripping broken glass. It only caused her pain. Her mother's words came back to her once again. Forgiveness isn't weakness. It's strength. Rosa took a deep breath and met Nathaniel's eyes. "What happens next is up to you," she said. "Trust can't be mended with words alone." Nathaniel's throat tightened, shame and determination mingling in his expression. "I know, but I'll prove to you that I can change. That I will change." Evelyn's voice was softer, but no less earnest. "We don't want you to just come back to the mansion. We want to help you, truly help you. Anything you need, we'll make it happen." Rosa studied their faces, the cracks in their confidence, the raw edges of their regret. It was real. They weren't the same people who had cast her out without hesitation. "Let me think about it," she said finally. Relief flickered in Evelyn's eyes. "Take all the time you need." As Nathaniel and Evelyn turned to leave, Miguel called out, "You know, actions speak louder than promises." Nathaniel nodded solemnly. "We understand." They walked away, the dawn's light casting their shadows long behind them. The door closed softly, leaving Rosa and Miguel in the quiet. A bridge between worlds. Days turned into a week, and life seemed to settle into a new rhythm. Rosa spent her days looking for new work, but the weight of what had happened lingered. Trusting again felt like trying to rebuild a bridge out of splintered wood. One morning, there was a knock on her door. Rosa's heart jumped, but when she opened it, no one was there. Instead, a small package lay on the threshold. She picked it up and brought it inside. Carefully unwrapping it, she found a letter and a key. The letter was in Nathaniel's handwriting. "Rosa, we've wronged you in ways we can't fully repair, but we want to give you something real, something lasting. The key is to a small home we bought in your name. Place that's truly yours. It's not a repayment. It's a recognition that you deserve more than what we took from you. Whatever you decide, know that we hope for your happiness and peace. Nathaniel and Evelyn Whitlock." Tears blurred Rosa's vision. She clutched the key in her hand, feeling the cold metal press into her palm. The gesture was more than she had expected. It wasn't just an apology. It was an acknowledgement of her worth, something no one had ever given her before. Miguel, watching from the kitchen, stepped closer. "You okay?" She nodded, wiping her eyes. "I think so. What are you going to do?" She stared at the key, the possibilities stretching out before her like an open road. "I'm going to see the house. Maybe this is a new beginning." Miguel smiled. "I'll drive you. Place to heal." The small house sat on a quiet street, surrounded by blooming hydrangeas. It wasn't grand like the Whitlock mansion, but it was warm, welcoming. A place to breathe. Rosa stepped inside, the wooden floors creaking softly beneath her feet. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, casting patterns on the walls. It felt like a sanctuary, untouched by betrayal or doubt. She walked through the rooms, each one whispering of possibility. In the living room, a simple wooden chair sat beside a table with a vase of fresh daisies. A card was tucked under the vase. "New beginnings are just as important as the past." Rosa's heart swelled. For the first time in weeks, she felt something loosen inside her. A knot of pain unraveling, making space for hope. The Whitlock's journey. Back at the mansion, Nathaniel and Evelyn were different people. The grand rooms felt emptier, the silence more reflective. They moved with purpose now, not with the cold detachment of their former selves. Nathaniel took a leave from work, dedicating his time to volunteering at shelters, helping those who had fallen through the cracks. People who, like Rosa, had been judged too quickly. Evelyn began hosting charity events that focused on the dignity of labor, recognizing the contributions of those often overlooked. The mansion slowly filled with warmth again, but this time it was real, earned through effort and sincerity. They knew they couldn't undo the past, but they could build a better future, one choice at a time. Full circle. Months later, Rosa stood in her garden, the scent of roses and lavender filling the air. The sun was warm on her skin, a gentle reminder that life moved forward. A familiar car pulled up, and she smiled as Nathaniel and Evelyn stepped out. They approached with tentative smiles, a silent question in their eyes. "Welcome," Rosa said softly. The word held multitudes. Forgiveness, acceptance, and the fragile hope of new beginnings. They entered her home together, the distance between them finally beginning to close. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And sometimes honesty was enough. Reflection. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Rosa sat on her porch, watching the light fade into twilight. The road she had traveled had been steep, fraught with betrayal and loss, but it had also led to redemption and growth. She took a deep breath, feeling the cool evening air fill her lungs. She wasn't the same woman she had been. She was stronger now, not because she had avoided pain, but because she had faced it and come through the other side. The world was vast and uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, she felt ready for it. In her pocket, her fingers brushed the key, the symbol of her new life, built on courage, forgiveness, and the quiet power of starting over.